And welcome everybody. Good morning. I hope you can all see my slides okay. I can see Julie, if you can give us a thumbs up.
Yeah, can see them fine.
Brilliant, good. So they've come through. Well, good morning everybody and welcome, and thank you very much for coming along. I'm Ruth Mitchell. I'm a plant ecologist at the James Hutton Institute and the group lead for the Biodiversity and Ecosystems group there. And it's a delight to be able to talk to you about DiversiTree today, which I'm leading, but it's very much a collaborative project. And you can see the collaborators there. So we've got Bangor University, Birmingham University, the Royal Botanic Gardens in Edinburgh, RSPB and the Woodland Trust, and then our project partners of Forest Research and Nature Scott. And it's been an absolute delight to work with everybody over the last sort of year and a half that this project's been going. So DiversiTree really does what it says on the tin. It's looking at diversifying our woodlands to increase resilience. And if my slides will move on, there we go. So what the project is aiming to do is to increase resilience of our current and future woodlands. And we want to do this by working across a range of scales. And we've deliberately put in there from microbes to mines to show that it's not just biological scales that we want to work across, but we really want to include that human aspect as well. And we want to understand the methods too and the impacts of diversifying tree species composition. So many of our current semi-natural and commercial woodlands are dominated by just one tree species. And as we know, we've got climate change and a range of pests and pathogens arriving that influence trees. And if those pests and pathogens and climate change particularly hit that one tree species that's dominating a woodland, then it can have a huge impact on that woodland. However, if you've got a more diverse woodland and you have the same pest or pathogen that targets a particular tree species, the theory is that the woodland is more resilient because you've still got a range of other tree species within that woodland. And that woodland can hopefully continue to function and provide many of the services and ecosystem functions because of the other tree species that are in that woodland. So what our project is aiming to do is to move from woodlands that are perhaps more dominated by one species to a more diverse woodland. But before we can do that, we need to think about a range of different things. We need to firstly think about people's attitudes to that. Do woodland managers actually want to diversify? What are their perceptions of diversification? What do they mean when they talk about a diverse woodland? We need to actually think about what tree species we might diversify with. Not all tree species will be equal. Not all tree species, for example, will support the same biodiversity. So if we're wanting to increase the biodiversity resilience, we need to have tree species that will support a similar suite of biodiversity. We also need to think about how the ecosystem functioning of our woods might change if the wood is diversified. In particular, could it actually bring some benefits? There's example in crop systems, for example, if you diversify a cropping system, then you actually get benefits in terms of a greater range of predators, and they provide biological control. But we don't know if you can get a similar sort of thing occurring within our woodlands. And then, of course, we also need to think about how we need to transfer that knowledge to the actual practitioners on the ground. And this really presents us with 4 challenges. So it's these 4 challenges that our DiversiTree project wants to address. So firstly, we need to understand how woodland managers and other stakeholders understand woodland diversity, at what sort of scale, and what are their ambitions in relation to future resilient woodlands. We need to think how we can diversify woodlands to provide what we call functional redundancy. So that is, if one tree species declines due to a pest or a pathogen, the functional redundancy is whether there are other tree species still present in that woodland that can fulfill that niche, and what tree species might that be. Thirdly, we want to look at this question of ecosystem functionality, and specifically within this project, we're looking to see whether increased tree species diversity results in greater microbial diversity, particularly on the leaf microbiome, and whether that change in microbial diversity can then help resistance against pathogen infections. And then the final challenge is how do we then actually implement and communicate management strategies to increase woodland resilience? So it's these 4 challenges that the 4 of us are going to talk about today. In some parts of our work, we are largely focusing on conifer woodlands because we haven't got the capacity to work across all woodland types. So we're focused on Scots pine as our native conifer species, at least in Scotland, and a Sitka spruce is a non-native but widely grown commercial species. But we really do hope to make our results transferable to other woodland types, and some of the work packages are working across a greater range of woodland types. So the 4 of us are going to take you through our 4 challenges, and it's a delight to hand over to Seamus first of all, who's going to talk to you about stakeholder perceptions of diversity.
Perfect. Thanks very much, Ruth. Can everyone hear me? You all good? And I apologize if I start coughing halfway through my presentation. I am on the lemon sip this morning, but I will push through like a trooper. Great. So so I'm Seamus Bates. I'm an environmental anthropologist at Bangor University, and along with Norman Dandy, we constitute the social science. We are leading the social science work package of diversity. So. How are we approaching our engagement with key stakeholders within the woodland management community? So just somewhat briefly, just to sort of give you the overview, we have been conducting a number of interviews, 20 interviews, in-depth, semi-structured or unstructured interviews with woodland managers. As you can see, we've got a geographical spread going from the north of England. We've got a nice knot in Cumbria and then across Scotland. And these are with a wide range of different stakeholders, people who manage less than a hectare of woodland, usually a small sort of amateur woodland manager, up to those managing very large 10,000 hectare plus commercial plantations. And in addition to this, we are supplementing this research gathering with a number of focus groups with core stakeholders from a variety of different groups, community groups, woodland managers, policymakers, academics, and environmentals. Thanks, Ruth. We'll go onto the more interesting stuff, if you like. Great. Now, one of our key motivations for engaging with this research is that there is an enduring straw man which appears within a lot of discourse surrounding woodland managers when it comes to diversity, and a lot of policy as well, still, even to this day, where we have these 2 very staunch binaries between either your conservation focused woodland manager with a conservation woodland, or you're a production focused woodland manager, and your woodland will only do production, and never the twain shall meet. Now, this is obviously a bit of a generalization in itself, but even with that said, we are still seeing this sort of dominance of this sort of ideology of this division in some quarters. It still endures to this day, and we find that a little challenging. And as you'll see, it isn't particularly reflected in the data. Thanks, Ruth. On to the next slide. I think you've gone past 2 slides there, Ruth. You're trying to trip me up, which is there we go. Thank you very much. As we say, there are far more similarities than differences. Throughout our interviews, when we're discussing with woodland managers how they come about making decisions around their woodland, about whether to diversify their woodland, how to go about doing this, whether it's necessary to diversify the woodland, whether that would be a good thing for their for the landscape they manage. Very often, woodland managers, regardless of their training, regardless of the sort of scale of their management responsibilities, very often, and we found this quite interesting, will refer back to feeling, gut feeling, experience, that kind of presence in the woodland, and how the woodland feels to them is as often cited as one of the key decision-making locuses, alongside what might be considered more formal data sets, analysis, sort of something which something for example, which Ruth or Lisa might produce for them, but actually just an intrinsic and sort of emotional connection to the woodlands is something which is repeated again and again. But with that said, and perhaps allowing this kind of experience and this kind of gut instinct is a very complex and very broad understanding about what diversity means when it comes to woodland management. Going well beyond, when we ask woodland managers to explore diversity in their woodland, it goes well beyond purely talking about trees. It extends to all flora and fauna, including even microbes and the microbiome of the woodland, as well as temporal, structural, and landscape diversity. There is a very broad and very widespread understanding, deep understanding about what diversity means when we discuss diversity in woodlands. There's a very, very good and complex understanding held by most woodland managers. And while there is a sort of valorization almost of nativeness, you find that quite often across woodland managers across the board, there is also a pragmatism to this, where the idea of planting native trees is not so important that at the expense of the woodland. And especially the case, of course, where the primary objective of the woodland is production, where obviously there are different objectives for the woodland. On to the next slide, please, Ruth. Next. And one of the key aspects, as we would expect, but it's nice to have the data to back that up, is that there is a very deep understanding of the relationship between diversity and diversification of a woodland and resilience building of that woodland. A very, very, again, intuitive, very, very instinctive understanding between a more diverse woodland being a more resilient woodland. And this is found, again, what I want to make clear here, contrary to a lot of the sort of assumptions made in certain discourse and around certain policy documents, this understanding of a more resilient woodland, a more diverse woodland generally being more resilient, or often being more resilient, is found across woodland managers, regardless of whether that manager is responsible for a production monoculture or near monoculture. Their understanding of resilience and diversity and diversification is just as complex and just as advanced as someone who is managing a conservation-focused woodland. Which leads us to ask, well, then why aren't we diversifying woodlands? Why isn't everyone planting more trees, more different trees within their woodland? And the answers which we receive are very wide-ranging, are as complex as the managers themselves and as complex as the woodlands which they themselves are managing. Often a belief that the woodlands are already diverse enough, rightly or wrongly. I know, but also a lack of understanding. Understanding is perhaps the wrong word there. I kind of regret putting it there. Guidance is perhaps a better word. A deep understanding around how the landscape is going to look over the next 10, 20, 30, 50 years, and an uncertainty as to what species will remain and which species will be available to carry on the woodland once the effects of climate change and new pests and pathogens become manifest. Thanks, Ruth. And so we, and as part of that challenge of knowledge sharing and understanding and guidance, there was something of a recognition that there are perhaps some barriers between different types of woodland manager, with a number of the more smaller amateur woodland managers reporting challenges in connecting with expert knowledge, but even amongst professional woodland managers, there are reports of a disconnect between public and private sectors, and this if only I didn't have the cult, these different groups finding it challenging to share information between them all, and limiting the ability for knowledge to disseminate, that's the word, between these different groups. Thanks, Ruth. Oh, actually, no, and we're actually going to move on to Ruth. And so in our sort of conclusion to this, to where we are now within our analysis, is that these simple binaries between are assumptions that one can make between, if you look at a sort of monoculture of a plantation woodland, there is this assumption that or often, too often, there is an assumption that the manager themselves has no interest or perhaps no understanding of the need to diversify, whereas a conservation woodland is perfectly diverse, and the manager responsible for them will be deeply invested in more diversification. The reality is, as I'm sure you'd all expect, far more complex. And we need to be looking more closely at the objectives, the key objectives, and the motivations and the reasons behind why different managers make their decisions beyond these kind of, as I said at the beginning, straw men. And that is where we are moving on to in our analysis right now. So speaking of complexity, I'm going to hand over to Ruth, where we can talk about unpacking those complex decision-making processes around what to plant and what species are based around different trees. So over to Ruth. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you very much, Seamus. So yes, I'm going to move on to our second challenge, and focusing on the sort of functional redundancy question and thinking about what tree species we might diversify with, and whether that diversity might support the same suite of biodiversity. So I'm specifically going to look at two questions that we've addressed in this area of work, thinking about which species actually use Scots pine and Sitka, because we didn't actually previously have that information, and then thinking about what other tree species those species might use. So what we've done here is we've used existing databases, so things like the British Lichen Society database or the fungal database of Britain and Ireland, and a vast amount of literature to try and collate information about species use across a range of taxon under a common format. And this has been done by all the people you can see listed at the bottom. And I'm really conscious that that one sentence methodological line hides a huge amount of work that has been undertaken by my colleagues listed there. And I'm really grateful to them for all the work they've done. There's been a huge amount of data cleaning and literature searching and months of work to get to where we are. So yeah, very grateful to them for all the work they've done to get us this far. And before I share with you some results that I think are quite exciting and hot off the press, I just want to run through some terminology. So we didn't just want to come up with a list of species as to what species use Scots pine and Sitka, but we also wanted to see how tightly associated they were with those tree species. So if I talk about a species being obligate with a tree, I mean that so far as we're aware, it only uses that tree species, or it can't complete its life cycle without using that tree species. And you can then see that we go down a scale of association, so through to high, where the species rarely uses other tree species, but it will, down to cosmopolitan, where the species will use a range of different trees. And because we weren't always able to find the information out at the tree species level, we've got the same suite of terminology, but at the tree genera level. So obligate genera, for example, would indicate that we know the species only uses pine trees, but we don't know if it just uses Scots pine trees. So just to make you aware of that terminology. So how many species do we think use Scots pine? Well, according to our calculations, 1,598 species will use Scots pine in total. And you can see how that's broken down by the different taxon groups in the graph here. So the bright red are the obligate species, and we reckon there's 217 obligate species, largely fungi and invertebrate species. And then there's a group of species that are obligate at the genera level. So for the lichens, we could only really do the analysis at the tree genera level, because lichenologists obviously don't know their tree species very well, and they'll just record that they found a lichen on a pine tree or a spruce tree without actually telling us which specific spruce or pine tree it was on. We've got 308 highly associated species. So it's perhaps those obligate and highly associated species that are most tightly associated with Scots pine and would be most at risk if Scots pine declined. And then 25 highly associated species at the tree genera level. If we compare that data to Sitka spruce, far fewer species, 670 that we've managed to find, and far fewer obligate species. So 6 species that are obligate that we're aware of. Some of these are actually non-native species that have come in with the tree. And a few of them we think might actually not be obligate. If you look at the tree species they use in continental Europe, for example, they seem to use a greater range of tree species. But in the Britain, certainly, we've only got records of them on Sitka. And we've got 12 highly associated species there. So what about the overlap in species use between the two trees? So you can see that the majority of species that use Scots pine will also, or some of them will also use Sitka. So the majority of species that use Sitka will also use Scots pine, whereas there's a lot of species that will use Scots pine that will not use Sitka. And we can then look at that sort of diagram and break it down by taxon group. So you can see for birds and mammals, all the species that use Sitka will also use Scots pine. For the invertebrates and lichens and the fungi, there's definitely a pattern that species that use Sitka will often also use Scots pine, but not always. Whereas the bryophytes are a bit different. There does seem to be more bryophytes that will perhaps only use Sitka, but not Scots pine. And this is probably because a lot of the data for the bryophytes, some of those species we could only look at the sort of tree genera level, not at the tree species level. What part of the tree do those species use? So you've got the different parts of the tree along the bottom, and the different taxon groups are the different colours. And this really highlights the importance of dead wood. You can see we split it down into different types of dead wood at the bottom there. But there is a huge importance of dead wood, particularly for the invertebrate species. So we perhaps need to think about not just diversifying our forests in terms of tree species, but also in terms of whether those trees are actually dead or alive, and the importance there if we're thinking about biodiversity. If we compare that for Sitka spruce, note that the dead wood is still quite important for the lichens, but less important for the invertebrate species. And then the next question that we wanted to answer was whether they'd use alternative tree species. And this is the set of 46 alternative tree species that we assessed. And I asked all the taxon experts to try and find out if their suite of species would use any of these alternatives. And you can see that some of these tree species would maybe be suitable for timber production, others of them definitely not, and they might be the sort of species that you diversify for more conservation objectives. But in terms of Scots pine, these are the results. I realise that's quite a dense graph, and I'll talk you through it. But we've got the tree species along the bottom, and they're split into our native trees and our non-native trees. Each bar represents our 1,598 species found on Scots pine. The white bits are the species that we couldn't find information for, so we don't know if those species will use the tree or not. The black bars are the species that we know will not use that tree. So there's quite a lot of black and white. So for quite a lot of these species, we either know they won't use the alternative or we couldn't find information out. The coloured parts show the numbers of species that will use that tree. So the bright green are information that we know the species will definitely use that tree species. So for example, beech is quite a good alternative, supporting 200 species. Norway spruce supports just over 200 of the Scots pine species, lodgepole pine. And then the sort of slightly lighter colours are where we've just got information at the tree genera level. So that's the yes genera So the light green will use that tree at the genera level, but we don't know about the tree species level. The blue is whether we think they'll rarely use that tree. So whether we'll rarely use that tree species, the dark blue, or rarely use that tree genera, the light blue. And the yellow is a sort of probable, so based on best information of expert knowledge. So for example, an invertebrate that generally uses broadleaf species, we might think would use beech, but we couldn't find information to confirm that. So for most of the species that we looked at, less than half of the associated species were supported. There's a lack of confidence about some of the species with the information only being available at the tree genera level. But there is an indication of the role of some of our native tree species. Certainly, if you just look at it, a combination of species and genera level, you've got sort of nearly half of the species being supported by many of our native deciduous tree species. Obviously, there will be differences between different taxon groups, and I haven't got time to go into that today. And we also need to think about the structure of the forest. And then finally, just to say, we also need to think about ecosystem functioning as well. And that's ongoing work that I'll present maybe another time, hopefully. We've got the same sort of information for Scots pine, and it's exactly the same colour scheme, so I won't go through it in as much detail. But again, there will be differences between taxon groups. And we not only need to think about the biodiversity supported, but also, of course, the sort of silviculture and our forest development types, about whether the alternative species would actually be suitable to grow together. But again, we've got things like beech and common alder and hazel being quite good to support a lot of the biodiversity that's also found on Sitka spruce. And then in the non-natives, we've got things like Norway spruce and sycamore coming out as good alternatives. So I've very much focused on the sort of larger biodiversity and the species that much of which we can see. But also, of course, there's changes in the microbial diversity. And that's really what Lisa's been looking at. So I'm going to hand over to Lisa now, who's going to talk to you through our work on sort of ecosystem functionality and the microbiome. So over to you, Lisa.
Thank you very much, Ruth. So my name is Lisa Lamberte, and I am a microbiologist and a research fellow from the University of Birmingham. Together with Professor Robert Jackson, who is also a microbiologist, we work on this work package, which is looking at the ecosystem functionality, the microbiome, and specifically looking at how the microbiome influences tree resilience against diseases. And so understanding how plants defend against diseases is very complex, and it involves a lot of various factors like the host genotype and its environment. However, a novel area of research is discovering the essential role of leaf microbes in protecting plants against diseases. And next slide, please, Ruth. So here, for this work package, we explore whether woodland plots with multiple tree species have a higher diversity of leaf microbes than woodland plots with one tree type. And so, next slide, please, Ruth. And so our aim is to see if having different tree species of woodlands helps create a more diverse group of microbes that can protect and shield trees from diseases. So this knowledge will hopefully guide us in developing strategies to enhance the health of woodlands. And so how do we do this? So just to remind you, we're asking whether various tree species nearby affect the diversity of microbes found on Scots pine needles. So just to clarify there, a monoculture refers to a woodland with only one type of tree, whereas a mixed plantation refers to a woodland with different tree species. And so We visited 2 areas, one in Scotland and another in North Yorkshire, where we've collected samples from different trees, some from areas with just Scots pine and others with mixed tree species like oaks and cherries. So we've taken these samples back to the lab and split them into parts. So one part helps us study the types of microorganisms present on the trees using advanced sequencing techniques. And the other is where we'll go grow and identify specific bacteria and fungi found on the pine needles. So the second question that we need to ask is, do these microbes on Scots pine needles protect against a fungal pathogen causing a disease called Dothystroma needle blight? And so Dothystroma needle blight is a disease that mostly affects cone-bearing trees. It is known for turning their needles red or red-brown and can really harm the tree's health. So imagine a whole plantation like this one, which is infected with DNB. So it not only looks bad, but also affects the tree value, both in the appearance and commercial use. So if this happened to the famous Caledonian pine forest, it would be a huge loss to the country. And so to answer this question, we've taken the bacteria and fungi we've grown in the lab and tested if any of them can control this pathogen. And so the ones that will show promise will undergo further testing, both in the lab and on the Scots pine tree themselves. So due to time constraints, I will only be able to show some preliminary results from the amplicon sequencing and the biocontrol screening. So please bear in mind that this is only for bacteria. The result for fungi is still underway, although I can tell you that's already looking very exciting to me. I would also like to caveat that for this figure and the next couple of figures are just hot off the press, like Ruth's data. And I know that I still need to do the statistics for this. So here you can see on the y-axis, you can see the Shannon alpha diversity measure. So just to remind you, this measure helps us understand how many different types of microbes are present and how evenly distributed they are in a community. So a higher measure, therefore, means a more diverse community. And then on the horizontal axis are the mixture types, whether they are a monoculture or a diverse tree species plot. So the box on the left is the alpha diversity measure for the diverse plot, and the box on the right is the alpha diversity measure for the monoculture plot. And as you can see, the measure for the monoculture of Scots pine is lower than that of the diverse culture. And this is what it looks like when I separated them into their respective plots. So there are 2 points to make here. The first is that you can also see the difference across the sites. So from left to right is the alpha diversity measure from the diverse plot in Ardros. The diverse plot in Rosedale, the monoculture plot in Ardros, and the monoculture plot in Rosedale. So the difference between the diverse plot in the Ardros or A21 seems to be higher than that of the Rosedale site, which is R8. And anecdotally, I can tell you that the Ardros or A21 site is composed of only 2 tree species, Scots pine and Sitka spruce, whereas in the Rosedale or R8 site, it is composed of other tree species such as oak, larch, as well as the presence of understory trees. Again, so the difference between the diverse plot in Ardros A21 seems to be higher than that of the Rosedale or R8 site. So this is what I was saying earlier about how it seems to me at least that if you have a more diverse culture, but the differences become a bit less than a plot that has only 2 tree species. Yes, sorry. And after that, what I did, I cultured some bacteria from the scalp spine needles and screen them for potential biocontrol activity, as it is one of the sustainable ways of controlling pathogens such as Dothystroma, which is a fungal pathogen. And so one promising example that we have is Bacillus velizensis, which I cultured from a scalp spine in a diverse plot. So here is Dothystroma on its own without any biocontrol treatment. And due to its slow growth, I've allowed it to develop for approximately 14 days before introducing the bacteria. And I've set up 2 plates, one without any bacteria added and one where I have applied the bacteria. And now this is the plates on day 22. So here's Dothystroma on its own at the bottom. At the top is Dothystroma with the addition of the 2 different bacterial species. So on the left of the plate here is an unidentified bacterial species that did not seem to show any biocontrol activity. And on the right of the plate is Bacillus velizensis. So there seems to be some dark discoloration, which is indicative of stress happening in the edge near Bacillus velizensis. On day 33, this discoloration has become more obvious, and even more so on day 36. And we know that this is biocontrol activity because first, you can see that the growth of Dothystroma has slowed compared to the plate with Dothystroma only. And then the second is the presence of what could be known as the white line inducing principle. So this is initially identified as a secondary metabolite produced by a different bacteria called Pseudomonas reactans. And this induces the formation of distinct white lines that you can see there. These lines emerge due to the interaction between this compound and another substance called tolacin, which is which is a toxic substance produced by Pseudomonas tolacin. So the organisms that we are looking at in our case aren't the same as those described in the literature, but it is certainly worthwhile to explore the biocontrol potential associated with this phenomenon. And so that's where I will end for today. So to conclude, our preliminary findings shed light on the role of tree diversity on ecosystem functionality by understanding the phylosphere microbiome and its role on tree resilience. And so our investigation into microbial diversity on pine needles indicates a higher Shannon diversity measure in diverse plots compared to monoculture, suggesting that diverse woodlands may foster a diverse microbial community. But moving beyond community profiling, we have also observed potential biocontrol activity exhibited by bacteria from a diverse plot called Bacillus velizensis against Dothystroma. And so future in planta experiments will provide insights on the practical implications of using Bacillus velizensis, as well as other bacteria from needles from diverse plots. So together, these early insights underscore the potential of leveraging microbial diversity for both understanding and enhancing woodland resilience against our pathogens. But of course, we all want our work to provide practical value to woodland managers. And so my colleague Chris is now going to tell us about how we are translating our research into advice for practitioners. Over to you, Chris.
Thanks, Lisa. Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Chris Nichols. I'm Conservation Evidence Manager at the Woodland Trust, and we're really happy to be involved in the kind of the solutions and knowledge exchange part of DiversiTree, which is all about putting practitioners at the heart of the project. So let's go to the next slide, please, Ruth. So quickly, just a bit about the Woodland Trust. We're the UK's largest woodland conservation charity. We own and manage over 1,000 sites, and we have around 500,000 members and supporters. We prioritise native trees and work to protect, create and manage and restore woodlands for wildlife and for people. And I think whenever we're working with practitioner organisations like the Woodland Trust or other kind of organisations that have different priorities and objectives, it's good to sort of acknowledge the kind of that people are kind of putting their own kind of there's always values that are going on top of evidence and interacting with evidence to inform practitioner decision making. So it's really interesting to incorporate lots of different elements: the social science, the microbiology, the biodiversity, the values on the ground. So we work to influence policy decisions. We campaign for the protection of woods and trees, and we fundraise and lots more. And a big part of my role at the Woodland Trust is our research collaborations, and we have a kind of thriving research program at the Woodland Trust where we collaborate using our sites or our data sets or our expertise or direct funding of research. And we've been really pleased to engage so heavily in the Future of UK Treescapes program through projects like DiversiTree, but also IDEA, Castor, New Leaf, the Tree Planet, Membra, Tree of Knowledge is a new knowledge exchange one. So we've been really engaged in the Treescapes program. It's been very kind of accessible for us as a practitioner organisation, which is great. But on to the next slide, please, Ruth. So what is a practitioner? I think a lot of you will already know this, but it's worth sort of thinking about, because it's someone who is actively engaged with the discipline or profession in practice on the ground at the coalface. It's the people who are actually doing the work. So the scientists, it's the people often where a lot of the impact is going to be realised in terms of real world. They're obviously very interested in evidence-based practice, but they have a lot of other competing interests, such as sort of, just a snapshot of what, the life in a kind of a day in the life of a Woodland Trust site manager. I don't know if Clive is on the call here. I took a picture of Clive from our intranet, so without permission. So I'm sorry, Clive, if you're on the call. But they've got to manage volunteers, the forestry kind of operations, fly tipping, operations such as sort of like infrastructure, like this kind of bridge in the picture. So they've got a lot on their minds, and often kind of scientific evidence can seem inaccessible or unavailable, not to mention kind of paywalls, but also just in the way it's communicated. So if we move on to the next slide. So in terms of DiversiTree, putting practitioners at the heart of the project, we, as a team, kind of we're going through these kind of three sort of steps: co-design, co-delivery, and operationalization, which is a kind of a grand word for what it is really. So if we could just click through these one at a time. Thanks, Ruth. So in terms of co-design, the Woodland Trust were approached really early in the development of the project, and it was fantastic that staff time could be factored in, because obviously practitioner organisations are busy and are not always have the time to kind of engage in this. But it's fantastic that we could engage as kind of knowledge exchange leads and co-develop the questions and the approach. And in terms of co-delivery, this is kind of all the ongoing work we've been doing as a project team, and just having a practitioner organisation as part of the project team is kind of a big part of that. But we've been doing a range of webinars aimed at practitioners, sort of through the Royal Forestry Society or ICF. More slightly, they're more technical, perhaps slightly more kind of accessible social media videos, and a key part of it is our practitioner panel, which I'll talk about in a second. But in terms of operationalizing the actual findings, we've been really conscious that when we're talking to practitioners, we want to include the nuance and the context, and listen and not preach to. I see already in the chat there's questions about foresters and practitioners not responding well to being preached at. So I think that's a fantastic kind of point, that exactly the kind of operationalizing that we want is to include that kind of thinking. But yeah, we'll be producing kind of accessible videos about some of the findings and applying that to case studies so it can be seen in a real world context, assessing the actual management interventions on the ground and not just kind of thinking of this in a theoretical place, and sort of aiming publications at practitioners and not just focusing on papers. And I think crucially, getting out on site with colleagues, both kind of the academics and the practitioners, all out chatting about the woods on site, and not just sort of kind of armchair discussions via a screen is the big, a really important thing. So if we kind of move on to just talk a little bit more about our practitioner panel, because it's been a part of the project that I think we've all enjoyed the most. I don't want to speak for everyone else, but it's been a really fun part of the project, getting out and meeting with a really diverse group of practitioners. You can see sort of a selection of organisations that have been represented in our panel, and we've met in person a couple of times already throughout the project, and we've got another couple of meetings coming up, and we go out on site and we kind of engage in kind of place-based two-way learning, I suppose you call it, if you wanted to put a title on it. But it's discussions, and it's actually, if we go to the just click on Ruth, it's about kind of providing the project with ongoing scrutiny throughout, and not just the findings at the end, which sometimes you might see in projects where it's sort of an afterthought. What does it mean for a practitioner? But actually, this has kind of been embedded throughout. We've kind of got a real diversity of experiences, and people who've got different viewpoints and different priorities and objectives when they're managing woods and trees. And we're asking them to kind of almost be kind of user testing as we go, and sort of assessing the feasibility of how we do it. And it's been a really kind of fantastic kind of free flow of ideas, and we've all made some great connections as a result of it, I think. And so this picture here is of Mar Lodge in the Cairngorms, which was where we visited in September, which was fantastic. And we were lucky enough to be joined by Holly McKelvey, who's a science communicator artist as well. And so it's just, I'm not going to go through these in too much detail, but I just encourage you to go on the DiversiTree website, on the James Hutton Institute website. Got a web page there where these are all kind of featured there, so to look in a bit more detail. But it just gives a flavour of some of the kind of discussions we have at these kind of meetings. So things like, in practice, what would happen if Scots pine declined due to climate change or a pest or pathogen? Kind of what other species might establish either naturally or through planting, and which species are missing. And so having some really kind of in-depth conversations on site with site managers, and using Mar Lodge as a kind of hypothetical backdrop. We're not actually going to be doing anything on Mar Lodge. That's beyond our remit. We're just there to discuss and use it as a kind of interesting backdrop, because it's been so dominated by one approach to management, which is kind of controlling deer and letting kind of natural regeneration and colonization take its place. So that's just kind of one approach. We're also really interested in other kind of management strategies for diversification, whether it's continuous cover forestry, or whether it's kind of some novel approaches to diversifying the kind of microbial communities in woodland, and sort of a novel kind of enrichment planting of and restocking of different species. So if we go on to the next image, so yeah, we kind of discussed all these sorts of things and different kind of how you would actually apply those management strategies on site. And all of these discussions will feed directly through to outputs into different case studies, and Mar Lodge specifically will be used as a case study in the project. So you see kind of a thought that will go into how we apply the project findings to individual sites. Yeah, I'm just conscious of time, so just to skip through route. It's really interesting, I think, to also think of the barriers to tree species diversification, which was a big part of our discussions on site. So things like just the sort of the local conditions. One thing in Scotland obviously is kind of that it's a lot more chance of kind of snow that are going to that's going to kind of overtop fences and prevent the fences keeping out deer. So there's so many different kind of practical considerations on the ground beyond just what we are kind of gathering data on in terms of the biodiversity associated with species, or kind of or just sort of the sort of more formal social science side of it. So I think it's really nice to get this kind of, we're not gathering data, but it's a really valuable part for how we communicate findings. So please do check out those on the website, and there'll be more coming from our next meeting in March. And just wanted to kind of flag that I think having a practitioner panel as part of these projects is a really valuable thing to kind of ground scientific projects in reality. So I'd recommend including it in future kind of funding applications, and including money for the practitioners so that they can engage properly. So I think I'm going to hand back to Ruth just to kind of sum up, and then we'll get into some questions. So thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chris. And yes, I certainly enjoyed the practitioners panel and learned a lot. It's very much been a two-way exchange of knowledge. I've probably learned more than some of the practitioners. So yeah, huge thanks to everybody that's been involved in those practitioner panels. Yeah, really just to conclude and say thank you all very much for listening. If you want to find out more about the project, as Chris said, we have got a website. So do go and look at that website. We've also got our X account and our Mastodon account, and my email address is there. So do please get in touch with me or any of the other speakers to follow up if you want to. But I'll stop sharing now and open it up for questions and discussion.
Thank you, Ruth and team. That was a really interesting presentation on the DiversiTree project, and lots of food for thought there, I think. There's quite a number of questions and comments in the chat, which we can touch on. But before we do that, I wanted to open up to the floor to see if anybody would like to ask a question or make a comment on what they've heard today. Can't see any hands up at the moment. So if we have a look at some of the questions in the chat, so starting with Seamus, your presentation at the beginning, Graham says that he was surprised that you found a barrier between public and private sector managers because there's a number of organisations that hold meetings that do field visits to help bridge those sectors. So he's just wondering whether you think that managers are not engaging with those more traditional forms of engagement. Are they sort of using other forms of engagement? Have you got any comments on that?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. This is something that came up. It wasn't reported by all managers, of course, but it did come up enough managers reported it. And I'm not, it wasn't that they were sort of rending their garments and saying it's the end of forestry or anything, but it was definitely something that people reported across a number of managers, this kind of lament almost that isn't it a shame? And it wasn't something that this obviously isn't the focus of the study, so it's very difficult for me to make any kind of grand generalizations around it. But I wonder, just coming out of these interviews, I wonder if there's perhaps a generational difference, a generational change in the way in which knowledge is being shared, perhaps is different now than it was 20, 30, 40 years ago, perhaps. Perhaps the transition that a lot of us have made to these online discussion spaces where becoming far more common is changing the way that knowledge is being shared and disseminated as opposed to sort of previous models. Yeah, it's something that I think I don't think it's some kind of crisis level at present, but I think it is worth acknowledging that maybe there has been a shift in the means in which information is being disseminated between different strata, different groups within the woodland management community. And maybe that isn't, maybe that has caused new barriers. Maybe it's broken down old barriers, but perhaps it has caused new barriers to form between certain groups. Yeah, I don't know.
Thank you. Peter, did you want to come in on that point? Or have you got another question?
In previous lives, I've been involved with the Royal Scottish Forestry Society, and I'm an ICF member as well. And it's been very noticeable that, especially in the last 10 years, that I think just due to time pressures, people aren't, that network that was in existence, say 20, 30 years ago, where everybody, went to your local RSFS meeting and, there's widespread ICF meetings, that has tailed off to a large degree. And I think it's just purely because of time pressures and, speaking to colleagues in the commercial sector, folk just don't have the time to put towards going to the suite of meetings that used to exist back in the day. And I think it is something, maybe it is generational, but it's something I've observed over the last 20, 30 years. It's been this tail off of having the time and the luxury to go to forestry meetings where, these sort of issues would have been discussed quite thoroughly.
And that final point there about it being a luxury, I this is not something which is unique to the woodland management community, is it? You know, this idea that it is being increasingly considered a luxury to, you know, go to a place not to do anything, if that makes sense, not to have a huge intention, a huge purpose, just to facilitate, you know, that collaboration and that conversation. You see it in academia, you see it in woodland management. I'm sure if we had a conversation of accountants or engineers or really any in industry, I think there has been, and again, I think the growth of using online platforms, which in some respects has been wonderful and allows us to communicate across much vaster distances, excuse me, but perhaps with bridging those much vaster distances and those allowing these wider conversations, perhaps we're losing something with the local at the same time.
I think we definitely have with COVID and the rise of Zoom. I mean, it's, you know, people rely on meetings like this a lot more. Obviously, ICF members have to kind of maintain CPD, but you know, I'm finding myself relying increasingly more on logging Zoom meetings rather than actually going out in the field and actually meeting people. I think it's a trend that started before COVID, but I think it's accelerated it, and I don't think it's particularly helpful, obviously.
Thank you. Okay, let's have a question for Lisa. A bit of clarification here. So just to confirm, so was the Bacillus valenciensis isolated from Scots pine needles themselves, or was it from one or more of the other trees present? And following on from that, was that microbe only found in the more diverse plots? And why did you only focus in on that particular one, or is that just the one you shared with us today?
Yes, yeah, I guess there's lots of things with that particular part of the work package. So firstly, to answer the first question, yes, this has been isolated from a Scots pine needle, and not from the surrounding tree species. I would actually really like to know if I could see it in the surrounding tree species too, and if they are actually genetically related. That's sort of like what I like, my field as a microbiologist. The other question as to why if there were others than Bacillus valenciensis that were isolated. At the moment, that was the one thing that jumped out to me. However, what I'm also seeing is that the presence of Dothystroma have also affected the bacteria and fungi that I have isolated from these Scots pine needles, meaning that they either they have slow growth, they have which I did not present here yet. So it sort of works as in the medical term they would call it dysbiosis, but I would probably think it's something similar to that one. So even though at the moment I'm still going through my my data to see if there was any other bacteria that do the same or fungi that do the same. But I've seen a lot of cases where the Dothystroma affects the bacteria that have already been isolated there. So that's also an interesting line of study that I'd like to pursue as well, to look at. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks. And now a question for Ruth. So you talked about dependency of other species on tree species, but the questions around climate change and the biotic impacts affecting those dependent species. So is there any way that we could perhaps predict some of those climate change drivers on the dependent species and how they might interact with the host availability? So the example given here is around drying on bryophytes. Have you got any comments on that?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. Obviously, we need to sort of think further forward, because obviously the woods we're planting to now will be hopefully around decades into the future. And we need to think about how both the conditions and the suitability will change, both for the tree species, but also the biodiversity that's found on those tree species. So Duncan's right that yes, that is something we're not able to look at in this project, but it is something you need to think about. And certainly as part of work that Chris Ellis from the Botanic Gardens in Edinburgh is doing as part of Scottish Government funded research, he's looking at how the microclimates in woodlands can perhaps mitigate some of these climate change effects. So some of you might know Chris is a lichenologist, and he's really looking at the range of microclimates that you'll get in woodlands and seeing whether you could manage those woodlands and the microclimates within them. So although the climate at the larger scale, at the sort of landscape scale, might be changing due to climate change, can you manage the microclimates within those woodlands so that you mitigate some of those climate change effects and there's still suitable conditions for those lichens to grow in? So yeah, really valid point, and there is some work being done on that in other research projects.
Thank you. Chris, did you want to come in on that?
Well, not specifically on that, but I was just really interested in the discussion going on in the chat about the value of sawmillers in terms of, and that's really, that did come up in the practitioner panel as well, about the kind of, I suppose the downstream, it's not just about what happens on site or what you plant or how it's managed. It is about kind of, where does the timber go? What's the capacity at sawmills, but also what other kind of, I suppose, downstream impacts, like how different species are valued or not in for instance, maybe the Woodland Carbon Code, or other kind of payments for ecosystem services that might be emerging. But also practicalities, not just downstream, but also, in the nursery sector. That's a really kind of important aspect as well to consider, where, where the tree supply is going to come from if practitioners want to diversify sites, and then what are the kind of biosecurity implications about different tree species, and what's the, if you're not planting trees, what's the seed supply like in the local environment? What's the is there any kind of ground disturbance to allow those seeds to establish? So there's so many different factors to come into the kind of practicalities around tree species diversification beyond what our kind of we're kind of looking at in the project. So it's a really kind of complicated but fascinating area. So yeah, I just wanted to pick up on that. It's really interesting.
Thanks. Duncan.
Yeah, so following on Chris's point, the interaction with the users, from the processors and harvesters right down to the markets at the far end of the chain, it is clearly a critical thing. And it's this sort of strange world we inhabit, where we are taking decisions, if we diversify tree species, which will have impacts on that end of the process in 40, 50, 100 years' time, however long it is. And I guess it's important to distinguish the most fundamental factors from some of the ones that are going to be able to be changed through different machinery, different processing technologies, that kind of thing. And of course, the biggest fundamental factor of all is just quantity. So when we start to think about diversification, one of the critical things for the production for the user end has to be, are we creating enough of a single type of product to get the economies of scale that are going to be necessary? So there's a lot of discussion in other places as well when we're talking about adaptation and resiliences. Yes, we have to have diversity, but it still has to come up with sufficient critical mass to make some of these systems work. So there's a tension there. If you have too much diversity, if you go for the fruit salad approach, then it might not be terribly useful in the long run.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think that's another thing that came up in our meetings with the practitioner panel, is sort of how much diversity is enough and at what scale. And that's because obviously once you get if you get a crazy diverse site with loads of different species, then one thing that came up in the practitioner panel is, yes, it might be more resilient to pests and diseases, but then if you need to, if you get statutory plant health notice and you have to remove certain species, it's much harder to do in a really diverse site, for instance. So, you know, the management implications of too much diversity is a really thing that concerns some people. But also, yeah, sort of, you know, how many, you know, where do you draw the line? How many species is a good level of diversity? There's no kind of answer, is there? Is it 5 species? You know, if you draw a line, and if you look at things like the Forest Research's National Forest Inventory and the kind of woodland ecological condition assessment, there are kind of, you know, different categories for how many species constitutes good ecological condition, but it's quite hard to kind of always kind of back up those kind of categories with evidence. And obviously that's something that we're trying to do, but it's not as it's never as simple as that.
I've got a question. Oh, sorry, Ruth. Did you want to come in then?
Sorry, I don't seem to be able to raise my hand. Oh, sorry, I found it now.
Oh, okay.
The option to raise my hand had disappeared. Apologies for interrupting. I was just picking
That's
up on the
fine.
how much diversity is enough question. And I think we also need to think about other types of diversity. And that's something very much that we're trying to address in the Tree of Knowledge project, because we're bringing together work looking, not just this project looking at species diversity, but also New Leaf that's looking at genetic diversity, and Membra that's looking at epigenetic diversity. And I think there's a whole discussion that needs to go on around, you know, if we prioritize species diversity, does that have trade-offs with genetic diversity, for example? Or if you prioritize genetic diversity, how does that influence epigenetic diversity? So I think we also need to be aware of those types of discussions as well. And yeah, don't have any answers, but we mustn't forget the other types of diversity as well when we're thinking about how much diversity is enough.
Definitely, and something that we did mention in the presentation briefly is that kind of, I think we called it temporal diversity, but I think kind of it's the sort of the age of species as well. And obviously that's considered in structural diversity, but often a lot of, if you're going for biodiversity benefits, a lot of those benefits are not going to be realized until the trees are much older. So that kind of, it comes into work around kind of ecological time lags. Just because a species can support a range of biodiversity doesn't mean it will anytime soon. And lots of woodland creation sites around the country, you know, aren't going to be great for biodiversity very quickly. And that's just kind of, you know, there's ways you can intervene to improve that, but I suppose there's so many of these kind of caveats to all of the results we're presenting that kind of that nuance is really important to scientists, but also to practitioners, I think.
This actually came up quite a lot in as there's a lot of frustration around a lot of managers where there's plenty of grant money available at the moment for new planting, you know, getting trees in the ground, as the expression goes, and there's a lot of money available for that. But also similarly, as Chris says, there are a lot of recognition that actually that's all well and good, and it will create new woodlands one day, which will be very diverse and very lovely. But right now, actually, there's not as much grant money there for maintaining current woodlands, and, you know, allowing those kind of veteran and ancient trees even from being properly supported, which obviously are critical for that kind of ecological diversity.
Thank you. We've got a couple more minutes. There's another question for you, Lisa. It's asking whether you're aware of how many potential biological control agents have been or are being screened for use against Orthostroma, and are they being isolated from a range of other tree species? And if so, do you know which ones?
Thanks, Richard, for that question. I'm actually not aware at the moment. I have to look into this more, see if there are other potential biological control agents used for specifically for DNB. I know that Bacillus valenciensis has been somewhat talked about in the microbiology sphere, in that it can also be a biological control for a range of other plants. But as for DNB specifically, not really. So I would definitely love to find out more about that. Thank you.
Thank you.
And also I was just gonna say I'm happy to chat more about the microbiome study. I can pop in my email in the chat for anyone who's interested.
Great, that'll be really good. And I think that goes hopefully without saying for all of the speakers today. If you want to find out more, please get in touch with them and with the project, so you can go onto their website and get their contact details on there. There is a hand up, but there's
Has our
no
Twitter
name
been,
associated. Oh, sorry.
I'm just double checking if our Twitter was shared as part of the presentation.
I'm not sure.
Because
Do you
that's-
want to put it in the
It
chat?
was on the last slide, but I'll
It
stick
wasn't
it
the
in.
last slide. Okay, yeah, just
Okay.
that's a good place to follow along.
Oh, Claire, it's you.
Hey.
I recognise you.
I don't know why my name's like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to follow up with Lisa as well briefly, if that's okay. Lisa, I'm Claire Feddy. I'm the Plant Health R&D lead in DEFRA. So just to explain some of the drivers for some of the questions that I've been putting in, and I suspect Richard as well. And it's to do with this thing of how much diversity is enough. So we're drafting our renewed trees and woodlands resilience strategy right now. So this whole issue of the link between resilience and diversity is quite important, and it's really helpful if we have hard evidence that increased diversity of any kind can have these tangible benefits. So for me, the really interesting bit of your work package is whether we can actually establish any kind of evidence that the more diverse woodland plots not only have more microbes in them, but that those microbes then potentially confer resilience to pests and diseases. So I agree with Richard that it would be good to look. For me, it would be more helpful if you continue to look across all of the species you've isolated, rather than zone in on that one, because we already know that that's found on Scots pines. So it's on the species anyway. And thank you, Richard. I'm glad I'm saying something that you agree with as well. But we can pick up with you afterwards and maybe have a separate one-to-one meeting on that.
Yeah, that would be really good. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And we are out of time, but that's been a really interesting seminar, very diverse project. And thank you to all of our speakers and all of the comments. As I said, if you want to get in touch with them, they've put their emails in the chat, so please do contact them if you want some more information or to have other conversations. But thank you everybody for coming today, and have a good rest of the day. Bye.